I want to talk to you about Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through 17. So I invite you to open up your Bibles, whether you have the electronic Bible app kind or whether you have a paper version, whatever kind. We are a Bible-believing, Bible-preaching church, and we want to continue our study in Luke. And today, we're going to find 5 great powers of life in this passage that we're going to look at. Last week, we talked about a verse that has been so helpful to many of us, Ephesians 3:20. Let me just read that one to you to get us started. Glory belongs to God, whose power is at work in us. By this power, he can do infinitely more than we can ask or imagine. I don't know about you, but those words have just been filling me up every single day this week, especially as Mary Kay and I have gone through this shoulder reconstruction on her part. It's such an encouraging verse. We learn that impossible is impossible with God, right? And remarkably, God wants to use his great powers through you and through me. He doesn't need to use us, but he chooses to do it. I mean, that is just amazing. And that becomes both the source of our power and also of our worship. We see that glory belongs to God. That's the source of our worship. It's also the source of our faith, as we see Christ at work accomplishing more than we could ever ask or imagine. Now, this is true not only when times are good and when we're feeling great about our Christianity and what we're accomplishing in God's good name, but this is also true, and maybe even more especially true, when we are weak, when we are down, when we are going through the tough times of life, as Mary Kay and I have experienced this week. When we are at our weakest, we discover that God is at his strongest. Another great verse that is a great encouragement to us before we get into our study today is from 2 Corinthians 9:8. That God is able to make all grace abound to you, and that having all sufficiency in all things at all times, you may abound in every good work. Wow. Now, how does this work exactly? What are these powers that God uses to work through us? Today, we come to the story of a widow. Her husband has already passed away, and she has one remaining son that is really the source of all of her life. And now we discover that this son has also died. And Jesus shows us through this story, seemingly coincidentally, and right in the middle of a funeral procession, we're told that Jesus brings this dead son back to life. Now, when we read things like this, especially if we have read it a lot, sometimes it loses the impact that we need to have. I want you just for a moment to imagine, you've all been at the graveside service of someone or another, and I want you to imagine that you're there and the hearse is open and the pallbearers are lining up and they're taking out the casket and they're slowly marching their way to the graveside. And I want you to imagine that a stranger shows up and stops the procession and says, "Put the casket down on the ground." I mean, that would be pretty weird right there, right? And then he says, "Open up the casket." Now we're into, territory, right? This never happens. And then I want you to imagine that stranger kneels down, touches the dead body, says some kind of words, and that the body sits up, gets out of the casket, and goes back to mom. Okay, now that's the kind of thing that happens here. And you should have this sense of wow, this sense of amazement, and, like these people, a certain sense of fright that something like this could happen. I think it would just totally freak me out. Wouldn't it totally freak you out? I mean, that's the story that we're facing today. That's the story that we're looking at. And I think we could just stop right there and say, "Glory be to God. Isn't God amazing? Look at what he did," and walk away, and we would all have the sense of the passage. But as I thought about these verses this week, particularly as I was watching Mary Kay going through her recovery. I reflected that within these verses, if we're willing to dig a little deeper, we find 5 great powers of life for the life of someone who is a Christ follower. So let's take a look at them one at a time. And I want to tell you something before, as we get into this, that these powers at first may seem like they're not powers at all. They may seem like, well, you just never thought of them as powers. But I want you to know that they truly are powerful. And that if you'll take what I'm about to tell you to heart, that this could have a profound impact on the way you live your day-to-day life and the way you experience the power of God in your life, in good times as well as in bad. So let's get into it. The very first power we want to take a look at here is the power of death. The power of death. You may not think of death as a power, but we see we're face to face, we're confronted with the power of death. In verse 12, Luke 7:12, he says, as he drew near to the gate of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. Now again, this first power I'm telling you about may not seem like much of a power. In fact, it may surprise you. We usually consider death as the ultimate weakness. But if you stop and you think about death as the separation, not the end, but the separation between this life and the next life, then death for us as Christ followers has a motivating power. There are things that you and I can only do on this side of death that we cannot do on the other side of death. We make our decision to follow Christ on this side of death. That's a motivating power. Only on this side of death do we have the opportunity to share the gospel of Christ with somebody else and help them make a decision for Christ. That is a motivating power. Only on this side of death do we have the opportunity to determine how we want to live our lives for eternity, even as we recognize our own mortality. See, every single day on this side of death, we are either becoming more and more like Christ or we're not. Every single day, we're making micro changes that are leading us to become more like Him. And we recognize that here on this side of death, we are in a season of life. This is a season of life that will never again be repeated. We're going to have all of eternity, and there's going to be a very wonderful life on that side of death. But we have a season of life on this side of death that will never be repeated again. You only get one chance to live on this side of death. Now, what will we do in this season of life? That's the question that we have to be asking ourselves every single day. In Ecclesiastes, we read this first couple of verses. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. You have a time to be born. You have a time to die. And you have a season in between. And the reality of death helps us to make the most of our lives here on earth. Jesus promises us in multiple places that there actually will be rewards for us in heaven on the other side of death that is based in part on how we live our life here on this side of death. He talks to us about sending on rewards ahead. He talks to us about building up our treasures, real treasures in the real heaven. So what are we doing in this season of life now? What are we doing now to send treasures on ahead of us? Will there be others inspired to live their lives differently here on earth after we're done, who see the change in us and who decide they want to be changed as well? See, that's the power of death. In fact, the power of death leads us, secondly, to the power of priority. The power of priority. I love how Luke describes this scene, and maybe you haven't played it out properly yet in your head, but let me read these verses and help paint the picture for what's going on here. In verse 11, Jesus, it says, he went to a town called Nain. It's the only time we hear about Nain. This is forever going to be known about the town of Nain, what happened in Nain. But he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a great crowd went with him. Now understand this, when we're talking about a great crowd, what kind of crowds follow Jesus? We know that there was one point where he fed 4,000. There was a point where he fed 5,000. I mean, when he had crowds following him, with women and children, it could have been upwards of 15,000, 20,000 people. Huge crowds followed Jesus. So we got this huge crowd following Jesus, and he's going into this town of Nain. And it says, a considerable crowd, in verse 12, back half, a considerable crowd from the town was with her. Now what we have here, we don't know why Jesus was going to Nain. It never explains it to us. We don't know what his purpose was. But what we do know is that there was this huge crowd following Jesus, and as he was going into the city, he runs smack dab into another crowd, the funeral procession that is leaving the city. And the two crowds combine. The two crowds come together. There's the crowd with Jesus, and there's a crowd with the funeral. And we see two valuable lessons here. First of all, I just need to say to you very quickly that crowds change when Jesus is involved. Did you know that? Crowds change. I don't care what kind of crowd it is, whether it's a rock and roll concert crowd or whether it's a funeral procession crowd or whether it's the crowd that you hang out with at work or whether it's the crowd that you're with at school. Crowds change because of Jesus. And so my question to you is, do you bring Jesus into your crowd? Because where you go, if Jesus goes with you, where you're at and who you're with is going to change because Jesus is there. The second thing that we learn here, and I think this is a valuable lesson for all of us, we should always plan our priorities, but we should also audible our priorities. We plan our priorities, but we also audible our priorities. Now, I would say that in general, we have two general kinds of people. We have people like yours truly, who plan almost everything he does. And some of you are planners, just by nature. You get up and you think about your day, you make a list and you follow the list and you know what you're going to do and you prioritize and you say, this is what I'm going to do. And some of you say, that just sounds horrible. What kind of life is that? Every day is a surprise. I get up in the morning and what's going to happen today? Your whole life is just one continuous audible. You know what I mean by audible, right? The quarterback of the football team has a game plan that's been very well thought out. They have planned it. And so the quarterback knows what's going on. They've got maybe the first 10, 15, 20 plays already called as they're going into it. But the quarterback goes up and he lines up and he looks over the defense and he sees a vulnerability. He sees something that could change his plans, and he calls an audible. And if he's really good at it, he can exploit the defense by making a change. Now, it doesn't stop them from planning, but when the opportunity comes, they call the audible. We should always plan our priorities, but we should also audible our priorities. And if you're a kind of person that's a planner like me, you need to learn how to call an audible every now and then. And if you're somebody who just lives from audible to audible to audible, you should be planning some of your priorities a little bit, all right? We need to be able to do both. You see, as Christ followers, we know that we only have so many days on this earth, and that it's important to plan our priorities, to really think ahead, to accomplish for Christ's kingdom, what we can while we're here. Now, Jesus, we don't know why, but we know that Jesus was going to Nain for a reason. We don't know what that reason is. He had a plan. But he runs smack dab into a funeral procession and a weeping widow mother coming out. And so right in the middle of these two crowds colliding, Jesus calls an audible. That's what he does. Whatever was on his plan is now out the door, and an audible comes in. And it takes great wisdom. Hear me here. It takes great wisdom to know when to call an audible. We read in Psalm 90:12, teach us to number our days so that we may get a heart of wisdom. And that's a powerful verse. That's a powerful verse. Teach us to number our days, to know that every single day we have is precious and to make the most of it, but to have the wisdom to know when to make a change. The power of priority is something that we can learn. Teach us to number our days. Do you see that? We can learn the power of priority. We start by recognizing the shortness of life and the worthiness of always searching for the good, for the better, for the best, and sometimes making the hard decisions to not do the good, maybe not even to do the better so that we can do the best, because you can't do it all, folks. You really can't do it all. Sometimes you have to sacrifice the good in order to do the best. And then at the end of the day, we continue by evaluating the opportunities that we had. What came up that I really couldn't have planned, and how did I respond to it? Should I have changed my plans, or should I have stayed with what I had planned originally? Evaluate both, how I changed or how I didn't change, and then pray over it. Ask God, did I make the right choice? Can you help me make the right choice next time? Ask for a heart of wisdom. See, wisdom is how to apply knowledge. Wisdom is how do I live my life the very best. And if you have the heart that says, I really want to number my days, I really want to prioritize I want to live by the power of priority in my life for Christ, I need to know how to both plan and how to audible when I need to. I just want to tell you, as a pastor, this is one of the not hardest things I've had to learn, but it's one of the more important things that I've had to learn. How to call the audible, how to change the plan. And some of you may be in that same boat, to either make a plan or to call the audible. So the power of death, the power of priority, and then thirdly here we see the power of tears. The power of tears. Come to verse 13. And when the Lord saw her, sees this widow who had lost her son, when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, do not weep. Jesus here runs into a crowd of mourners, and he sees this woman who had lost her husband and now has lost her son. And I want you to understand that in the economics of that day, there was no Social Security support. There was no widow's support. There was no church yet. And when a woman who really had no power to work, who had no power to own property, who had no power to earn anything, her entire dependency was upon the men in her life. But her father is long gone. The man that she had married is long gone, and her son is now long gone. Every single provision that she has ever counted on is now gone. She's lost all of her support. Now, I'm sure that she was very sad to have lost her son too, but do you see there's this crushing economic reality invading her life in addition to the loss that she's experienced? It's like everything is gone. It's like her life is gone. Her mourning is deep and obviously very loud. And we see that Jesus, had compassion on her. The power of tears is a very great power indeed. We have focused so much as Americans, we have focused so much of our attention on the pursuit of happiness, because that's one of our inalienable rights. And so we pursue happiness so much to the exclusion that sometimes we completely forget about the power of tears. In fact, in our culture, men are even taught how not to cry. We learn from a very early age to withhold our compassion, to suppress our emotions. That when there's something going on that is very sad in our life and others are weeping, we choke it in, we hold it in, we choke it down. We've learned from an early age to do this because we're told that in order to be able to fix things, we have to divorce ourselves from that emotion. We have to separate ourselves from that emotion so we can fix it. And we have forgotten that there are some things that can only really be fixed by feeling the depth of sadness that somebody else is experiencing, even when we don't feel like it. going, you all know what I'm talking about. Your life is going okay, you're going good, finally. And, somebody in your sphere of influence has just learned some devastating news, and they are experiencing deep sorrow. And my question to you is, do you run to it, and do you open yourself up to experience that same sorrow, to have compassion, or do you avoid it? Do you stay away from it? What Paul describes when he's talking about the early Christian life, he tells us that we should actually put on things like compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience. You remember that verse? And he tells us that we should put it on, that we should literally clothe ourselves in it. Isn't it interesting that he starts with compassion? Take a look at Colossians 3:12. You are the people of God. He's talking about you all now. He loved you and chose you for his own. So then, you must clothe yourselves with compassion. It's the very first thing he says. You must clothe yourself with compassion. It's a verb picture, if ever there was one. It's like, you are who you are, but now you must put on the coat of compassion or the shirt of compassion. You literally put it on. You mean I sometimes have to put on feeling sad for somebody else? Absolutely. You may not feel it right away. You may try to block it right away, especially if you're a guy and you've been trained from birth to not do that. Sometimes we confuse this putting on compassion with the gift of mercy. Let me explain the difference to you. Mary Kay, her number one spiritual gift is the gift of mercy. We know this because we've both taken spiritual gift tests. And, it gives you different choices of how you can respond. And her number one gift is the gift of mercy. And anybody who knows Mary Kay knows that's true about her. That's just a natural way that she responds. I don't think any of you will be all that surprised to learn that it is my least greatest gift. I just, naturally don't have a lot of mercy built into me. I have teaching gifts. I have leadership gifts. I have administrative gifts. But the gift of mercy, not so much. Now, here's a question for you. Do we excuse ourselves from being compassionate because we're not particularly gifted with mercy? Not at all. Paul very clearly says here that we clothe ourselves with compassion. Why is that? Because being able to empathize with someone else's loss is the most God-like emotion that there is. God also had and continues to have compassion on you and me, right? Aren't you glad about that? That God loves us. In fact, he loves us so much that he gave us his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him might have eternal life, might have a relationship with him. That's compassion. And God has compassion upon you. And if we are followers of Christ, we want to be more like Christ, more like God, we need to become more like compassion. That's how we start. We put it on. And so this power of tears is a very real power. The power to be able to cry when somebody else is crying. The power to be able to share the depth of that sorrow. Sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. There's just nothing you can do other than to go there and to be there with someone who is experiencing that depth of sorrow. Very powerful. And if you are missing out on that power, you're missing out on a great power of life. The power of tears. Power of death, power of priority. And then fourthly, we learn about the power of new life. The power of new life. Verses 14 and 15. Then Jesus came up and he touched the bier. That's the thing that they were carrying the body on. And the bearers stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." And the dead man, now it's very important we get this, the dead man When it says he's dead, what does it mean? Does it mean he swooned, that maybe he just stopped breathing for a while, that maybe they resuscitated his heart? No, we're talking about somebody who was dead, gone. The dead man sat up and began to speak. Oh my gosh. And then Jesus gave him to his mother. That would be one weird scene, wouldn't it? Now, the entire reason that we can see power in death, which also gives us the power of priority, is because as Christ followers, we now have the power of new life. We have it right now. We have new life because we have Jesus. And wherever Jesus goes, new life goes with him. Paul tells us in another place in the Bible that the old is gone and the new has come. And we will be, sometimes we get this confused, we will be resurrected someday. But we right now have new life. You already have life eternal. We will be resurrected to a new body, but right now we have eternal life. We are eternal beings already. And that changes everything about how you live your life. The way we look at life, the way we think about life, completely changes when you begin to recognize this power in your life. Because you're no longer just here today, gone tomorrow. You're no longer this 70-odd year expectation of life expectancy, or longer for some of us, right? We know death only as a transition to the life beyond, and so we live this life differently today. And there's great power, great power in new life. Power to live life for today, in this moment. Power to live for someone else or for something else. Power to know that there is ultimately good that will come out of everything, no matter how bad it is at this moment. Power to know that God wins in the end. Power to know that I'm on God's side. And so when God wins, I win. Power to know that whatever grief that we suffer today, right here, right now, whatever it is that we're going through, this is only temporary and will be replaced someday by an eternal joy that can never be squashed. Great power. Great power. Power of death, power of priority, power of tears, power of new life. And such new life, such frightening prospects, if you really stop and think about it, lead us ultimately to this last one, and that is the power of worship. What we experience today so powerfully by our praise team, and hopefully all of us, the power of worship. Let's read verse 16 together. Fear seized them all, and they glorified God. Fear seized them all, and they glorified God, saying, a great prophet has risen among us, and God has visited his people. Can I just talk straight with you for a moment? We don't often connect the emotion of fear with the act of worship. I love it that we're comfortable here. I love it that we have a place to meet one another and a place to come and be joyful. But you know, when we come into the presence of God, there should be a little bit of fear involved in that process too, right? Should be a fearful, awe-inducing experience. Because we begin to realize just how little we know when we come into the presence of an omniscient God. We begin to realize just how small we are when we come into an omnipresent God. We're in this little space here, and he's everywhere. We begin to realize just how sadly weak we are when we come into the presence of an omnipotent, all-powerful God. And when we begin to see the kinds of things he does, like, raising a dead man back to life, it should be fearful. It should be awe-inspiring into our life. And just like these people at Nain who see this dead man, this dead son coming back to life, we should be amazed and awed and a little scared about the presence of God in our life. And ultimately, that rightly leads us then into glorifying God, which is another way of saying worshiping him. Because we realize that we're his people. And we realize that we worship him, and we realize that he visits us with his presence. And when we really experience his presence as it really is, even just a little taste of it, it really should send us to our knees. Ask yourself, when is the very last time that you truly experienced the real fear and the real respect of the Creator God, the Creator of all the universe? When's the last time you had the real fear, the real respect for God as you sang to him, as you prayed to him, as you read his word? How much time today or weekly do you spend preparing your heart and your life to come into the presence of God? I mean, is this a time that's marked off on your calendar? Do you wake up first thing in the morning and say, today I especially come into the presence of God? I'm going to start confessing things. I'm going to start cleaning things up. I'm going to prepare my financial gift. I'm going to prepare my serving gifts. I'm going to come into the presence of God as if I may not survive it. That's what Sunday should be like for us. It's not a matter of, do I do this or do I do something else, right? It's a matter of saying, God's going to be there, and I want to be there too. And the more that I experience his real power in my life, the more it pushes me into real worship. And the more I begin to experience real worship of this awe-inspiring God, the more I experience his power, and I can go out and serve him with these other things. The power of priority, the power of death, the power of tears. I get all that from God, from worshiping him. They go hand in hand. Because of the power of God, I worship. Because I worship, the more power of God I have. And there's something very powerful about this experience of the worship of God that we serve. Something very filling, something very edifying. Understand, you were made, literally, as beings, you were made to worship God. That's your unique ability. Not just to sing, but to worship him, to honor him, to glorify him, to make a choice for him, to love him. And you realize that this day that we worship him today, this is not the end, this is the beginning. Because we leave here having worshiped, we now go out and we serve, and then we come back and we do it over and over again. We worship, we breathe in the power, and then we go out and serve, and we breathe out the power. Is that how God is working in your life? Breathing him in, breathing him out, breathing him in, breathing him out.